time is one example, isn't able to value his or her own life is another example, and therefore you see the propriety of infanticide promoted in the highest levels of bioethics literature. People like Terry Schiavo are also deemed to be non-persons because of illness or injury. They've lost those capacities. And that's why you see in some of the most notable bioethical journals, the most notable organ transplant journals, the promotion for the idea that rather than waiting for people to die to harvest their organs, we should be able to kill the cognitively incapacitated for their organs. That's not being done, I hasten to add, but it is being promoted at the highest levels of bioethics advocacy, and that's how policy changes. From the intelligentsia, from the academy, from the ivory tower, there's consensuses reached, and then that is moved down into public policy, and that's what bioethics is all about, and that's what my book, Culture of Death, The Age of Do-Harm Medicine, seeks to warn people about. The idea of the doctor as believing in the Hippocratic Oath is becoming archaic. In fact, doctors no longer take the Hippocratic Oath because its maxims get in the way of some modern views of utilitarian medicine.
You know, the thing that people don't reckon with, let's zoom out, let's go over to Obamacare for a second, and you realize that's what is happening in social medicine. We see this much more in Great Britain, by the way, than in the U.S. or Canada, is the fact that the patient becomes the odd person out in the whole formula. The government, the insuring body, and the doctors and or the healthcare organizations, they make all of the decisions, and then they inform the patient of what's going to happen. So if you just add euthanasia on top of this, plus the fact we know all of these programs are going to be in very real trouble financially very quickly, you can see where this will wind up.
Well, it's already wound up there in Oregon, where Medicaid is rationed. In 2008, two patients, Barbara Wagner and Randy Stroops, both with terminal cancers, were prescribed chemotherapy by their doctors. This was not to save their lives, but to extend their lives. And we know that's a very large part of oncology practice. Often when somebody is not going to be able to be cured from cancer, chemotherapy can be prescribed to extend their lives. When my dad was dying of colon cancer, he was supposedly going to die in a month or two, so he took that last shot of chemo, and it gave him an extra year. And it gave him an extra year of relatively good health. That is a normal part of cancer care. Well, the Medicaid people from Oregon wrote a letter to these two patients and said, I'm sorry, Medicaid will not pay for your chemotherapy because you're not going to expect it to live long enough for it to be worth the money. And then said in the letter, but we will pay for your assisted suicide. Can you imagine? Barbara Wagner went public and she said, good grief, my state is saying they will not pay for my life, but they will pay for my death. So it's already happening. Just recently here in California, there was a story that came out that the media didn't cover much. A woman in an HMO was denied payment for life-extending chemotherapy for her cancer, but was told by the HMO that they would pay for her assisted suicide and that her out-of-pockets would only be like $1.63. It's just an astonishing thing, and yet people say, well, there are no abuses on assisted suicide. What's the danger? It's just compassion. It's death with dignity. It's just astonishing to watch.
And the creep is just going to be more and more because you and I both know, first of all, Medicare is in trouble, and they're robbing from Medicare to prop up Obamacare for private insurance. Obamacare is already a disaster with the companies pulling out, even though we hear from some of the politicos during this campaign season, oh, it's working, it just needs some things that need to be fixed. You know, you can't make fly something that was never intended to fly.
Well, the problem with Obamacare is the centralized control. And the worst of it hasn't even gone into effect yet because the Affordable Care Act has in the law that they're supposed to set up cost-benefit guidelines through the centralized mechanism of Obamacare that would then be used by insurance companies to pay for or not pay for particular treatments. The issue isn't necessarily efficacy. It's cost and perceived benefit. There's something in England that is used that is not permitted right now in Obamacare, but New England Journal of Medicine, New York Times, and others have argued that it should be, and that's called the quality-adjusted life year form of rationing. And here's how that works, just generally speaking. I have a good friend. He's got multiple sclerosis. He's in a wheelchair. So let's say that I get a diagnosis that says I have 5 years to live if I take this medical treatment, and my friend in the wheelchair gets the same disease with the same diagnosis. Well, you would think that those two, in terms of even of cost-benefit, those two would be measured the same, but they aren't under a quality-adjusted life year because under quality-adjusted life year, my friend in the wheelchair's quality of life is deemed lower than my quality of life as an able-bodied person. So let's say that I am given 5 quality-adjusted life years as an able-bodied person to receive this medicine. My friend in the wheelchair is given 2.5 quality-adjusted life years for the same condition. So then they say, okay, it costs $100,000 a year, that $500,000 for Wesley to be kept going and for his friend to be kept going. For me, they might say, well, $100,000 a year, that's worth the money. But for my friend, it would be $250,000 a year because his is only 2.5 quality-adjusted life years, right? And they might say, oh, that's not worth the money. So you end up with medical discrimination against the elderly, people with disabilities, people with physical problems in terms of chronic illness and so forth under the quality-adjusted life year. And it also becomes a matter of politics. In the UK, people with late-stage cancer might be denied chemotherapy based on the quality system, but 42-year-old women have a right under the law to expensive IVF applications. Even though a woman who's age 42 and can't conceive, that's not a disability, that's just nature. But you end up with whoever has the political power. Their constituencies are never rationed out of in healthcare rationing systems, while people with a lower political capital can often find themselves deprived of needed and life-extending treatment.
One wonders why these things stay afloat.
Because the elite, this is their agenda. The people who run the medical intelligentsia, this is part of the emerging technocracy in which many among the people who have the highest education, who run the institutions of society, do not have faith in individual freedom, and they think this will be a better society, that if we allow the experts to create a controlled and planned method of society, that somehow things will be better, things will be more equal, and things will be more prosperous. But I think the opposite is the case, because when you end up with that kind of system, those with the power to decide make the rules, and the rules are going to benefit them and hurt people they perceive to be the other.
That's true. And also, people who can afford it go to Mexico, where clinics will spring up that will provide the services.
Yes. Well, you see that right now in Canada. But Canada has a single-payer healthcare system that we're supposed to emulate. Well, rich Canadians, they will fly to the United States and pay for health care here because they don't want to wait 18 weeks to get an MRI. My friend, he lives in Canada, he had symptoms of a stroke, and it took him 4 weeks to get an MRI. Can you imagine? Luckily, he didn't have a stroke. And I've even met people from Canada where the government will actually pay the University of San Diego to do the health care for the Canadian, and the Canadian government will pay for it. But imagine having to fly 2,000 miles to get surgery and then also to pay for your own hotel and all that while your loved one is being cared for. And this Canadian man said, that's a great system. I said, how is it a great system when you had to go from Canada to San Diego for your wife to get good health care? People have different expectations.
Well, it's just the area that we're running into. If you put a free market thing on it, you could have more health care for more people. But it's interesting. Free things always sell, Wesley. I don't know why socialism keeps selling, even though it keeps damaging incredible numbers of people.
Well, yeah, it's interesting. Young people fall for it because they want everybody to be cared for well. You know, I'm certainly not a libertarian. I do think that society has an obligation to those who aren't able to care for themselves. I don't want to be in a system where my health care is planned by elites who don't know me. And there's something called feudal care, F-U-T-I-L-E. And it's the law of Texas and a few other states, that if you are receiving life-sustaining health care that you want, medical treatment, say in the ICU, and the doctor doesn't think the quality of your life is worth living, even if you do, the doctor has the right in Texas to say, I don't want to provide this treatment anymore. It goes to a hospital bioethics committee, and if the bioethics committee says no to the health care, realizing that this can cost the hospital money, by the way, because of our method of funding health care these days, a capitated system where the hospital gets a lump sum, well, that patient can be denied wanted treatment 10 days, and their only option is to get another hospital, many of which won't take the patient because they're going to be expensive. That is based on a quality of life judgmentalism. That is medical discrimination. We're told that choice is the primary thing when it comes to assisted suicide or refusing life-sustaining treatment. But when you want this treatment, suddenly choice has its limits because this idea is developing that there is such a thing as a life less worthy of living, and it's very frightening. And when I post things at National Review on the Corner, a lot of very libertarian-minded people will say, oh, well, they don't have anything to contribute to society, and look at the cost of care. Since when is that the factor to determine whether somebody receives wanted, efficacious medical treatment that extends their life? That's supposed to be the quintessential purpose of medicine. But we're changing that now to eliminating suffering, and if you're suffering and we don't want you to suffer, even if you would rather suffer and still live, too bad, we will kick you off of health care so that you die. And that is actually happening now, not everywhere, but in a few places in the United States. Not to mention the pressure that people feel when they go to a hospital to stop treatment. That is sometimes well-meaning, and I believe there comes a time when you should let nature take its course. But sometimes I think it gets wrapped up in the economics of the thing. And that's another reason I wrote Culture of Death. People have to be forewarned that when they go into the hospital, if their loved one is seriously ill, they might find themselves in an adversarial situation, and it's something they need to be aware of.
Yeah, we've actually experienced that firsthand. All right, we're out of time here. Wesley J. Smith, Senior Fellow at the Discovery Institute.